Welcome to Surviving the Dream with your hosts, Casey Arnold
and David Conley.
We're here to talk to people who seem to have their dream job and find out, what did it take? Is it what they imagined? Is it worth it? How do they do it?
Join us as we uncover the secrets of surviving the dream.
Hi, Dave.
Hello, Casey. Are you surviving 2025 so far?
So far, so good. We're still in single digits, so it would be bad if it was a problem already.
Okay, well, that can change very quickly. All right, so who have we got today surviving their dream?
All right, so I'm excited for our guest today, partially because he does something that I really enjoy looking at in life, so that way I think I'll be able to participate in the conversation.
Should we just pause for a minute and think what that could be that you like looking at in life? And go and see if our listeners get it right. If you want to go there
right away and bring it so highbrow, sure. No, our guest today is an architect, and he specializes in sustainable architecture, which I'm very excited to learn more about. So, hello, David Hertz.
Hello, how are you?
Thanks for being here with us.
Thanks for joining us, David. Wow, a real life architect who builds buildings. Have you seen The Brutalist yet?
No, I haven't. I've seen the preview, and it's on my wish list.
Is the preview as long as the movie? I think it's about 4 hours long or something like that. I must admit, it is. It's a really good. I've got to say, from what I've seen of it so far, it's a really good movie. But I'm splitting it over several evenings because it's so long. Yes. And even as I'm splitting it, the intermission came. And I went, oh, great. It's very long.
It does look fascinating.
And,
I'm looking forward to watching it.
Do you draw we're going to fight over talking over each other.
Yeah, we're so excited. I think what's interesting is that it's that period as well that the architecture was. I mean, it was a controversial thing to bring that to America, the brutalist architecture. And I've just been looking at your website, which how would you describe your architecture? Or do you have a saying for it, or is it just buildings?
I try not to really have it narrowly defined by a genre style. I think if anything, it would be considered a kind of contemporary organic architecture because it stems from kind of a philosophical kinship that originates with Frank Lloyd Wright, more of a uniquely American architecture that is of its place, and sourcing materials locally and making environments that are more naturally based and working more in harmony with nature. So, contemporary organic architecture would be probably the closest moniker.
That definitely shows. We were looking at pictures and talking before you came on, and I'm like, I would happily live in any one of these homes. You do such a good job of like embracing the nature and the light, but also creating such a beautiful structure. Like how does factoring in the sustainability part shift like how you do a design versus before you did that, or were you always a sustainable architect?
Well, I really grew up more as an environmentalist first, and then had to rationalize my place in the world as a part of the built environment, which is, of course, incredibly destructive. So when I was in architecture school in the 70s, we had, of course, our oil embargo, and I think we realized our dependency on foreign oil, and that generated ideas on solar and how we can be a little bit more independent, and then I've always practiced sustainability before it was kind of a word that was used, and was at the formation of the U.S. Green Building Council and looking at green buildings, and have evolved somewhat because I don't think we've ever been able to achieve true sustainability, and we're more in the resilience imperative now in terms of how do we respond to the impacts and stressors of climate change.
Do you think we'll ever be able to like really work with it, that we're doing good without creating harm?
I do think that's a construct that could absolutely happen. I think as a species, we just haven't yet evolved to utilize technologies, and we're embroiled in, competing interests, with capitalism as a overriding concern. It cares more about the short term than the long term. And if we survive the journey, I mean, so like to answer your question, yes, we absolutely can. I think there's a way that we can. Will we? That's a different question.
So when you're designing a house, are you thinking of where it is as well geographically, so that I can get the materials, I can source local materials? Does that come into your thinking?
Yes, that's definitely part of the thinking, because when you look at the totality of what we take, make, and waste with a building, there's a lot of consumption of raw materials, and that involves transport. And so the closer one could source materials, the better. Not in all cases, because I recently did a project on a remote island, and everything's being brought to that island anyway. So at that point, why not just bring more efficient things longer distances? But in general, the embodied energy that is from usurping primary raw materials, we don't even think about things like that typically, like aluminum. It's like, well, it travels around the world multiple times by the time it, starts with mining raw materials like bauxite under tropical rainforests, and then getting shipped to China, and then processed, and then coil rolled, coming and then extruding. And so there's a lot of embodied energy along the life cycle of building materials. However, the life of buildings and the maintenance of buildings and operations of buildings generally far exceeds its first cost, and and also has long-term environmental impact. So I think you have to weigh both sourcing locally, but also how one could operate and maintain a building, using resources efficiently.
Does that go into the transport as well? Because you've already spoken a little bit about the transport. I mean, like we're in California, and they're doing a big drive to electric cars, and I see that I was watching this amazing thing about how they're converting all these trucks now to be electric. Does that? Do you factor that in, or are we still not there yet?
No, we're there. And actually, LA is kind of the electric truck capital of the world. And that's definitely happening, and that would reduce the embodied energy. But one has to look at all of that. I mean, it's not that electricity necessarily is completely, carbon neutral either. Right. Depends on the source and the impact of batteries. So if you really have, to do what's called a life cycle analysis, is to look at all materials extracted along the entire raw material process and the life cycle of the project, and then to tally those all up, and then ideally to come up with a solution where when people call it, say, carbon neutral, that is that the cumulative impacts of building the building and operating the building are offset by some of the positive things that the building can do, like convert light into electricity, for instance, or reduce, the transportation in the first place. So the goal is to reduce the impact as much as possible in the first instance, and in the second, to minimize operational cost and expenses that have environmental expenses and consequences.
So I want to, I feel like we need to backtrack for a second though. What is it that took you from being an environmentalist to realizing, if I become a sustainable architect, or realizing that you loved architecture? Were you building like the most awesome tree house as a kid, like with the actual tree it was on or something? Like how did it all start for you?
Well, I grew up in LA. I grew up primarily in Malibu and in Venice, and my parents were very creative. My mother was a fine artist. My father was a surgeon, but also built a lot of things and kind of an inventor and always constructing things. So in some ways, architecture at a pretty young age became a field that balanced in a way, or integrated in a way, the art and science. And I was always interested in building things as a young kid. My mom used to say, you take apart the vacuum cleaner because you're curious about the mechanisms. I didn't put it back together, but I could take it apart. And so I've always had an inquisitive mind about the way that we make things. And that lent itself to kind of evolving into architecture at a pretty young age. I think, when I was in junior high, I was doing a lot of industrial arts. I was fortunate growing up in California to be at the birth of a lot of kind of cultural revolutions and innovations, which included the birth of skateboarding, the birth of BMX, motocross bicycle riding. And so I, used to build my own bicycles and make my own skateboards, shape my own surfboards. So I learned pretty early on. This was before the internet, and we were actually making a lot of making things. There was still kind of the legacy of industrial arts and education, and so it's actually interesting in retrospect that I really was that, my career, it's been now 41 years, but over that period of time, there's been some fundamental shifts in terms of the way we've done things. I mean, when I started, we drafted, right? And when I was in junior high, I was doing technical drawing, technical drafting, like, drawing nuts and bolts and building tools and things. So I thought it's interesting to be at that transition between a kind of completely digital way of making and a more tacit way of making things.
Well, I'm interested. So, it sounds like you're interested in the building, like taking apart your mother's Hoover and stuff. But how does the aesthetics come into all this as well, and how do you balance that out with what you want to do?
Well, I think aesthetics is the progenitor of everything that I do, and I don't think one could do have a compromise in any way between a design and being responsible also professionally. So I always, a lot of times the design idea starts with an environmental idea. Like my wing house is a pretty classic example of that, where working on a remote hillside in Malibu that was formerly the estate of Tony Duquette, who was a master appropriator of found objects from the Hollywood set industry. The only American to have a solo show at the Louvre. He did movies like The King and I, and he would bring these sets up after they were disused. So he was really interested in found objects, and that got me really thinking about, well, why extract raw materials, as we were saying as a segue to our last conversation. Why not just reuse materials that have already been used, perhaps in a kind of a radical reuse manner? And so the idea of reusing the wings of a 747, made a lot of sense in terms of the philosophical connection between the appropriation of found objects that Tony Duquette had on this property and the pragmatic concerns of something that was low profile, that can deal with high winds, that had a certain thinness and grace to it, and that allowed for a structure that was essentially a floating roof that didn't have walls to capture the incredible views. So all those things came together, and that's why I guess the process is also very organic. It may start with a strong concept, like that became the concept. Hey, I started sketching ideas as if, this was a curved ceiling and it looked out towards a mountain range and it was very low and thin. It reminded me of these laminar flow diagrams from airplanes. I said, oh, maybe I'll make roofs that look like wings. And then I said, why not use wings? There happens to be thousands of airplanes in California deserts. And, what would that practical reality look like? It turned out that it was incredibly economical to buy an entire airplane for about $30,000. Which is the price of the recycled materials, and that most of them are being, downcycled and turned into, like a beer can instead of, an airplane where billions of dollars have gone into engineering this incredibly efficient structure in the first place. So that's is an example of a kind of organic process that started with an idea that in the concept was then led into the execution. Now, of course, the inspiration is much easier than the execution, to then get through 18 different governmental agencies and move a wing across 5 freeways and a helicopter to bring it down to the site. And, but that was an analysis in embodied energy, because I saved the mining of bauxite and aluminum transport and all the things for new raw materials. And it was a large, less strategy, meaning that this remote site would require lots of trips, and each one of those trips would have a certain amount of energy and carbon input. And if I could do a large kind of burst of carbon, with this helicopter, but it's only, a 2-hour round trip, it's much less than multiple trips with small materials, of which we typically build. None of the materials really fit. I mean, different than, say, the UK, but we build out of wood mostly, and nothing is really built to those dimensions. So about 30% of everything is construction and demolition waste. So that requires transport to haul away as well. So this large less strategy, this idea that you take this, amazingly efficient use of materials to achieve the highest strength at the lightest weight, and then use it in, kind of a static manner for a house, saved a tremendous amount of energy in raw material extraction and transport.
So if each house,
Go.
If each house or each build is its own unique thing, depending on, where it is and whatnot, like, what would you say your favorite part of the process is? Is it like coming up with the image in your mind? Or is it the like, oh, I have this cool image. Wow, there's a whole lot of nuts and bolts of like, where do you source a plane? How do you move the plane? How do you turn it into a roof? Like, do you have a favorite part of the process that is like the real driver of what keeps you going?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that the most enjoyable part is the ideation phase, the conceptual phase, that coming up with an idea, and then and then there is a challenge in getting kind of a radical idea through a very risk-averse system. I mean, part of that is somewhat subversive in a way. I mean,
that's the skater boy in you living his best life.
Yes, that's definitely. There's still a certain rebelliousness, a kind of at the end of every no is a yes, push to come up with something that hasn't been done, but then is at least professionally managed to deal with the realities of the pragmatic realities of executing something on time, on budget, and that's safe and meets all the code requirements. So I think there's a kind of a perverse joy in a way of creating something that's really challenging and then trying to get it done. That oftentimes not the most fun part of it. The idea of it is fun, but then the execution of it has a lot of drudgery, because it requires constant energy to try to execute something. But then at the end, then there's a reward for having done that, right? So there's always and construction is also a really rewarding process, because you actually start to see the fruition of your ideas, manifest themselves, three-dimensionally. But I would say almost less so now that with computer, because, we used to build models and it was pretty cumbersome, and you didn't have as many opportunities for iteration and design. And then now with 3D models and virtual reality, I mean, it's somewhat anticlimactic to see it, because you've pre-visualized it, almost reality. But I like the tectonics, the nuts and bolts, of how things go together, and that's rewarding still.
And how flexible do you have to be with that? I mean, there must be, are there occasions, I'm going back to the brutalist, when they say, oh, actually, we want it to be 20 feet shorter than that. And he was like, no, I'm not doing it. Who are you ultimately answerable to? Is it the client?
Ultimately, I mean, ideally, you're ultimately answered to yourself in terms of your own aesthetic and what you feel is. So if you felt like that, reducing that height made a huge difference in terms of the proportions and everything that, you felt so strongly about, then that, that's there's a lot of integrity in that, because essentially everything is compromised from the point of the concept down, right? I mean, because it's an art and it's a service, and that's there's always a delicate balance. And then there's all the practical realities of building codes and structures and, laws of physics and the client demands and contractors and budgets. And so, it's almost like you have to start off with a really strong idea because it's so prone to being whittled down. But, I think you have a balance first to yourself. And I think, you're doing your client a service by, maintaining an integrity. That's, I think, why they hired you in the first place. And to protect the client sometimes from themselves and to argue for your ideas. But also it's a balance of ultimately it's the client's, house. And so I think it's making sure that you're aligned, your visions are aligned in the beginning, and ideally it's collaborative and there's mutual respect that yields the best project in the end.
So how would junior high David feel about his place in the architecture world?
Oh, I think he'd be impressed, because what happened in junior high was that I had a guidance counselor that, and I said I was interested in architecture, and he said, oh, I think you should, I don't think that's realistic for you because you don't have, a math, high math scores. And, at that frame, I kind of said, well, wait, you're a guidance counselor at a public high school. Like, what have you done? But it pissed me off just enough to say, well, I'll show you,
And sometimes the motivation comes that way.
Yeah. And so having that kind of angry, rebellious kid and being told no has much more incentive for me than encouragement in a way. And and so I'd look back at my junior high self and say, see, you told him.
Are you living your dream now, do you think?
I think so. Yeah. I mean, I really do. I think if I look back at it referentially like that, and I had fantasies of, building my own home, I did that. I'm doing some really interesting work in the preservation of this Tony Duquette village I'm landmarking that I live in. I live on a property with regenerative agriculture, with restoration of habitat. I'm really involved in resilience. I'm a wildland firefighter that started a community brigade, that's really creating defensible space and actively engaged. So if I look at it from the outside in and not in the day to day, I'm totally living the dream. It's incredible. Sometimes it's hard to appreciate it because, you're not always looking at it referentially and from the outside, and you have a conversation like this, then you start to put things into perspective, which is always interesting. I mean, that's why I enjoy doing these types of things. Yes.
Yeah.
We make people realize they actually are happy.
Yes. Right. Yeah. I mean, happiness is very elusive, and I think if it starts with gratitude, then it's pretty easy to be happy. Because I think happiness is, it's fleeting in a way, and there's so many competing interests for, are you truly happy? Is it because there's materialistic culture, there's, society, things are happening so quickly. So, I mean, it's just a question I've been asking, myself, but if I look back and said, I'm totally living my dream job. I mean, this is, the best parts of it. It's just that, there's a lot of it which on a day-to-day basis is not necessarily, joyful.
Well, that's interesting. It's at the payoff. I mean, I think most people have. I mean, when I was training as an actor, we had a psychologist from Russia who said that, by the way, if anybody's purpose is to be happy, you will be disappointed your whole life. It's impossible. So, but you're probably fulfilling your purpose, to use his phrase. I mean, but what's the payoff? Is there things where you go, is it? I think all of us go through this where you go, is it worth it? But and it sounds like to you, whatever it is, it's worth it. But is there a payoff where you look at the other side? Does it interfere with your personal life? Does it interfere with your financial life? What is it that you go, God, I wish I could sort that one out?
I don't think there's anything, ultimately that where there's any regret about it, and there is a tremendous amount of gratitude for everything that I've had. I mean, it is a profession that you have to love. It's not like you're an architect, and I mean, I'm sure there are people that maybe work for other people or whatever, and that's a job, but it permeates every part of your existence. And I think I have generally, like, just coming off of the holiday, I had like a day off, and it was incredibly anxiety provoking.
It's too much downtime. I need structure in my day.
I mean, I really had to do some deep searching about that, because it's, there's the tyranny of kind of the emails and the structure and the schedule. And, it's like a 7 a.m. to 7 p.m., minimum work day. And that's, and then trying to turn that off. But I could theoretically retire if I were to, change my lifestyle or whatever. But that doesn't seem to be anything that I would ever contemplate. Like, most architects, they get better and better, as they get older, and they get more highly valued as they get older, which is nice because it's not always the case in, most other jobs.
Yeah.
And it's also an incredibly complex profession that, requires to any form of mastery, much more than the 10,000 hours, that's touted often. I mean, it's, probably a 10x multiplier of that. It's got to be like 100,000 hours or something, just to be able to begin to understand the complexities of architecture. And then that's dynamic and changing, and the world is changing, at a faster and faster pace.
Do you have a thing that you do, like in your downtime or in your non-work mode mind, that kind of keeps you fresh and available for inspiration, or like balances out the doing of life?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I live in nature. I live, in Malibu in the hills. I have a large property. I'm, looking out the window. There's, a whole world of beautiful nature and species. And I've created a landscape, that's super contemplative, and we invite people in.
We'll be right over.
That are, that really appreciate the restorative aspect of, of what the land and the buildings, the old sets and everything, this little village that we're next week about to have officially landmarked here in the county. But I surf. I still surf. I grew up surfing, and surfing's a an incredibly important part of my life in terms of really feeling, I guess, engaged in the natural world, and being confronted with the changing conditions, and the way in which you kind of interact with people in that environment. So that's important. I think getting out, hiking. We do some interesting work in terms of kind of wellness and regenerative work through yoga and mind work and other explorations that are personally really expanding the sense of self and give you renewal, and that's ideally, if you have something that's planned and not just like an unplanned day where it could be anxiety provoking.
Do you feel like that stuff informs your designs? Like, have you seen, as you evolve as a person, like, does your design aesthetic change, or is that, a thing of the times? Like Dave and I were talking before of like how it's interesting that there's all the like boxier, modern looking houses now with like the wood trim. Like, and I live in West Hollywood, definitely in my area. It's like, that's definitely a trend right now. Is that because of cost or what people want? We don't know. But like, do you see a trend in that? I just asked you 7 questions in one. So pick whatever part of that speaks to you.
No, that's fine. I mean, so yeah, there's a kind of style, right? There's like a lot of what you might be seeing in West Hollywood that would be, typical, might be seen as derivative of earlier work that other architects have done, but it's in a kind of simulacra and in a decorative box, right? Like we started in LA, especially as a kind of fantasy land. Everything's fast food, it's like also fast culture, and the buildings aren't really made to last, and they're ephemeral, and they're wood, and they have a 20-year life or less, and somebody just tears them down and builds them again. So a lot of what you see, like I'm thinking about West Hollywood, is that, and most of LA is basically just a box, because it's kind of an urban lot, and there's a building envelope that's defined, and then it's how do you decorate the box? And then we start with, it's Tudor, and it's colonial, it's all these other things. It's like, well, why does it have steep roofs? It doesn't snow here. Why does it have small windows when they can make glass and large? Like, so there it becomes a certain synthetic Hollywood kind of stage front. And so if it's wood slats, and it's just part of that simulacra. I don't feel like it's as deep as an architecture could really be, that it grows out of the land in organic fashion, and then it's in the way it's built is innovative. I mean, even if it's going to be a box, like when I've done a lot of projects in Venice on very tight lots, I've tried to think about the way that box is built as not just being decorated. So it's been tilt up concrete, it's been made out of refrigeration panels, it's been made out of even when it's materials. Like I did a house, where we purchased all the old cedar benches from the Hollywood Bowl, and then used that to build the house with all the numbers, that are engraved in. So there's a certain story, a provenance that makes it less of a skin deep facade, I guess, if you will. And so that's my architecture. I try to do that. It's also less commercially, I guess, viable, because there are a lot of people that are risk averse, and say building a home or a building is a very costly venture, and not knowing what you're going to get requires a certain adventurous client. And my work, if you look at my wing house or sail house versus tilt up slab house or Californication house, you can't necessarily say, oh, that's a style. Like, I don't know exactly what I'm going to get with David Hertz. And I'm, because it's a service, I could say, oh, okay, well, you want something that you like, that you respond to that. I could riff off of that direction and certainly collaborate on that. But there are other architects where it's very predictable. You could look at their work and everything looks pretty much the same. And that's much more economical from a business model because they could just kind of cut and paste. And maybe it's even more predictable. There's kind of a trap, with commerce and art. Like if you look at an artist and, that artist has a certain prestige, and that person who's paying a lot of money for that artist wants someone to recognize it, and the gallery wants that work, like it's going to sell. And I'm sure it's the same as an actor or anything else. It's like, well, you get typecast into that role. You have one successful role, then, that's who you are. And the goal is always to keep inventing yourself, but that's hard to do that, always commercially. So I tried not to have a particular style, and I don't lead with style. I try to lead with substance and then let style follow, ideally.
Do you ever have a moment in architecture where you think that's my moment that you look back on that you feel fulfilled? Is there a moment, or at any stage? I'm talking like as someone who's made movies. I always thought, oh, it's the premiere, and then you get to the premiere and going, oh no, it wasn't the premiere. That was the least exciting part of it.
Yeah, the most exciting part of it is the next project.
Right.
It's really there are momentous occasions like closing the freeways with the wing house, and then in the helicopter, and like certain milestones in construction, or tilting up the concrete slabs. Those are exciting milestones. I think for us, I think a lot of times it's photographing the project, like after it's done. It's just been a construction job. You're just, you're only really looking at the problems for the most part. You're going through this punch list. It's like you're looking at every little detail, and you're just, and everybody's generally, it's a long and arduous process. So to have a moment like with my sale house recently, which is on the island of Beckway in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, my clients are British. And, that was quite rewarding to go down with a photographer and spend several days and look at the light and experience the shadow and the texture and the prevailing breeze, and to actually live in the structure that you designed, and then to become hyper aware as to all those things, and then try to capture that quintessential moment is incredibly rewarding, even though that's, also a lot of work to, keep moving around and photograph and collaborate. That's when you step back and you look at the finished work.
And is it like, do you ever look at your mistakes? I find like, I remember my first movie that I made, and I didn't realize until someone pointed out, the editor said, oh, you never noticed that you'd left a bit of tape up on that. And every time I saw that movie, that's all I could see was that bit of tape.
Right.
No one else ever saw it. Yeah. Yeah. Does an architect think
always
like that?
Yeah, always, for sure. Yeah. There's so many details like that, there's always little things. There are not as many design decisions as much as like construction things that could have been constructed better, should have fought for that a little bit more.
I feel better knowing that it's like that on your end too, and not just people like me trying to do a renovation and then looking at like the counter or the wall or the whatever. I'll be like, oh, I was just so tired and stressed that day. I said it was fine, but now it haunts me.
Yeah, I know. And that's a difference, is that these things are, there's a certain permanence to them, or a perceived level of permanence, that over a period of time that, that you really don't want to make those compromises, because they will be around for a long time, and you don't want to have to look at those mistakes for the rest of your life.
So speaking to that, when people look at your work, like what would you like them to most take away from it?
Well, I think that there's a certain kind of integrity of thought, a thoroughness of thought, a certain innovative kind of out of the box thinking that elevates it to architecture, beyond kind of mere building. that makes architecture closer to art in the level of thinking about it, and kind of I think also in a non kind of academic way that people just feel good, right? Like they say, wow, I just love this space. I didn't think I liked contemporary architecture, it's
Mm-hmm.
like talk about like brutalism or whatever, this sensibility. But I think I like when people, respond very positive, like, wow, I didn't know that like concrete and raw wood and steel could, glass could come together in such a way that's still so harmonious and makes me connected to the natural world. I mean, part of my origins in being connected to the natural world and continuing to be natural world is that I, I really try to deconstruct the confines between interior and exterior space, and that's a hallmark of my work. And working certainly in Southern California for the large part, we have this remarkably equitable climate where we could do a tremendous amount like that.
Mm-hmm.
And in working in tropical climates and some of the other places that I've done, it's all about how can you be really connected. I sail, and so I'm also, really enjoy kind of the hardware and the moving with the wind and the waves. But so the sail house itself was kind of an extension of sailing, these huge tensile membranes. The whole project was built in Java and flat packed, shipped to Beckway, and assembled. The whole house was prefabricated, including the electrical, plumbing, mechanical, furniture. The whole house was assembled and then disassembled and then reassembled on the site.
Wow.
And it collects 100% of its own water, makes 100% of its own energy. Just went through a major hurricane. Certain
And it
parts,
made it through.
certain parts of it are really designed for disassembly.
Oh God,
And,
that would have been awful. He said, "Oh no," then it went.
It sounds like, because I've written for children a lot, I feel like that's like the ultimate dream. And like, did you play with Legos growing up? Do you like IKEA? Well, this is the most heightened, awesome version of that. You envision the house and
yes.
it's like ready to go. That's incredible that you could do that.
Yeah. So that was really an interesting study, and dealing with, a global perspective of, many different cultures and many different practical realities of, importing and exporting and customs and tariffs and visas and cultural, integration between a kind of Caribbean and European, like German engineering and meets Caribbean, workers versus, Javanese. I mean, very interesting mix, and in a very kind of remote and foreign place. And those are exciting, projects, especially when they all come together.
Yeah.
So you're striving for perfection as well as an architect, I presume. Is perfection ever possible?
No, and I think it's a setup. And I don't really strive for perfection. I mean, I think it's like happiness. I think it's if that's your expectation all the time, you're going to be set up for disappointment. I think but and that's all. There's lots of different definitions, of perfection. But no, it's not. The world is not perfect, and it never will be. And if you try to strain, I think you're, like as you said, your Russian mentor. I mean, I just think that you're setting yourself up.
Right.
So, but we strive for an incredibly high level of quality and integrity of thought and execution.
Well, this has been amazing, and I can't believe I could speak to you for another 3 hours, but unfortunately, we're coming to the end of this podcast. So we're going to come to the questions that we ask everybody else. If you won the lottery, the big one, what would you do?
I think I would largely do what I continued to do. I mean, I would really accelerate giving and and trying to institute fundamental change in the world for those less fortunate. That I've always thought, like, if I had money, nothing would give me more joy than to give it away, but to give it away in really meaningful ways that I think move the needle on resilience, on, and I've done that with our own kind of resilience foundation and with, boards I'm on of nonprofits. But yeah, I think that would be a huge thing, would be to just give it away and to be in charge of impact and try to make as many meaningful contributions given, our brief moment on Earth.
I hope you win the lottery so you can do that.
Probably should start playing it now.
Right? That's always the missing link. My super heady question, what is your go-to snack? And also, is there a snack that's sustainable that we should maybe all start looking to?
Well, of course, anything you could grow would be, the most sustainable. We actually grow passion fruit, a lot of passion fruit, and so a lot of my snack, like my favorite snack is walking out to the farm and grabbing a passion fruit and biting the top off and squeezing it, like you get such a jolt of flavor and antioxidants and energy, but anything that is sourced locally, that's organic. I mean, one of my go-to snacks is, like, I love trail mix, like ever since I've been a kid and backpacking, and but it's not necessarily the most sustainable, given that nuts, especially in California, require so much water use.
Mm-hmm.
So, final question from me: what's your favorite animal and why?
Well, there's a lot of them. I mean, I definitely have to say dogs. I mean, I just think dogs give unconditionally. They love unconditionally. They're always happy to see you, even if you've been gone for a little while. So the relationship that I think one has with a dog, domesticated, is pretty profound. I've always had dogs in my life.
All right. And my final question, if we really knew you, David, what would we know about you?
I pretty much think what you see, you get. I mean, I'm always looking at the next thing. I've been very interested in, I have a diverse practice. I don't fit the traditional role of the architect. I've been very engaged in atmospheric water generation, localized energy and water. So those are things that, people say, well, wait, I don't understand, how is an architect, making water out of air? Those, they very engaged right now in wildfire mitigation and defense and fighting, learning kind of the power of nature, really confronted that, whether it's in the ocean or with a fire. Those are really compelling. So I think I think that I didn't think long and hard about the dream job, but I do think that this is certainly my dream job. And I think if I had the lottery, and I would still always be an architect, I would just pick and choose the projects, more selectively, that were more personally fulfilling, or be my own client and really try to, push the boundaries. I think the thing that is probably the scariest for me is like pure art, like just, looking at a blank canvas. I mean, it would be very, very interesting to see what would happen, but I've often thought about that as pretty challenging. Maybe that'll be something I do one day. But in the meantime, it feels like I feel more comfortable organizing problems, and orchestrating and coordinating this series of sets of structural things rather than a pure self-expression.
I think there's going to be a next chapter for that. And I hope we get to see what it looks like.
Well, thank you, David. This has been fascinating. Really enjoyed talking.
Yeah, thank you so much. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for engaging me.
And if people want to check out more about your resilience or the water fund, is there a place people can check that out or donate?
Yeah, sure. They can go to David Hertz, architect.com, or just Google David Hertz Architect. And on that, they'll see more about SkySource, which is the skysource.org, the atmospheric water generation, or the resilience foundation that is donating to United Nations sustainability development goal projects globally.
Fantastic. Let's all save the world together.
Thanks, Dave.
Thank you. Quick shout out to Mike Nicholas for being our tech savior, and Carmen Sclafani, also known as Wiser Time. Thanks for our music. And thank you all for listening.